Open container of alcohol in the vehicle.
That was not me.
That's not you?
I was not drinking.
Now that you've witnessed a portion of this traffic stop, I'd like you to try and guess what happens next, because if you get it correct, I'll be very surprised. Not only is it completely unexpected, but it results in some of the most jarring audio that I've ever come across, and I mean that. The state trooper involved in this incident is a US Army veteran with a wife and a 2-year-old child at home, but despite serving in Afghanistan, this routine stop back in his home state of Texas was going to be the worst thing he'd ever experienced. So, I'll tell you everything, but as usual, let's get into the backstories first. On the 22nd of March in 2006, 29-year-old Stephen Stone, a Texas Department of Public Safety or DPS trooper, was working his shift near a city named Tyler. As previously mentioned, Trooper Stone had joined the DPS after 6 years in the US Army, including service in Afghanistan as military police. And on this night, everything was going as usual, until he noticed a pickup truck traveling above the speed limit on Texas Highway 31. So naturally, Stone decided to pull them over.
Adam, George, Sam. Speed.
The driver followed orders. Trooper Stone parked up behind him and walked up to the driver's side of the vehicle. Stone notices open alcohol in the vehicle as well as a change in the driver's behavior. And so he tells the driver to step out of the vehicle. The driver, 37-year-old Ramon Ramos, does eventually listen, though we can tell he really didn't want to deal with this at this time. This driver also had a passenger with him in the front seat, who was a 38-year-old man named Francisco Salcedo, and both of these men were from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Pretty quickly after Ramon got out of the car, the trooper grabbed the booze and put it on his hood before evaluating Ramon and deciding to arrest him.
Open container of alcohol in the vehicle.
That was not me.
That's not you?
I was not drinking.
Okay, I got a bag full of drugs here. Take your jacket off!
Begins putting the handcuffs on, and he did manage to successfully secure one cuff, but this is where things change, and they change very quickly. As Stone began to put the second handcuff over Ramon, Ramon's passenger, Francisco Salcedo, exited the vehicle.
Stay in the car! Get in the car! Get in the car!
In that moment of distraction, Ramon, having only one cuff on, pulled a 9mm handgun from his waistband, quickly turned around, and opened fire on a state trooper. The initial bullet tore into Stone's left shoulder, and additional shots followed rapidly. Stone's vision would have failed and his hearing would have gone silent as he dropped into the roadside ditch. And as this was happening, Salcedo reached back into the car, grabbed one of his firearms, and joined the assault, and both men continued firing at the wounded trooper for a period of time before entering the vehicle and speeding off. What follows this is very rough, and not even so much because of what you see as Stephen Stone was quickly sent into the ditch, but more so because of what his microphone captures. The audio we hear of this state trooper calling out afterwards is not at all for the faint of heart. Of course, I have to respect YouTube's guidelines on this sort of thing and tread lightly, so I'll only be showing you small segments, but believe me, that's enough. I can't show you 20 minutes of footage anyways. The following audio might be difficult to listen to for some audiences, so viewer discretion is advised. Let's take a listen.
I'm not shot! I'm not telling you what it is! Help!
1414, can you give me any kind of vehicle information?
It's gonna be a blue pickup truck.
Despite these two men hitting him many times at point-blank range, Stone was still very much conscious and determined to survive. He climbed from the ditch, assessed his condition, and crawled through the darkness to his patrol car. He radioed the DPS dispatch center in Tyler to a dispatcher named Shelley Alexander, who maintained communication with him while help was mobilized. Deputies from the Smith County Sheriff's Department arrived in around 5 minutes and found Stone with life-threatening injuries, but rather than waiting for an ambulance, they placed him in their patrol vehicle for an emergency transport to East Texas Medical Center, One of the people who responded to the scene, Deputy Brian Allison, was actually certified as an emergency medical technician, so he administered first aid throughout the high-speed drive, and this was care that a sheriff later said may have been the key in keeping Stone alive because, yes, believe it or not, Trooper Stone survived this incident. Despite the amount of shots these men fired, it would not be enough to take Trooper Stephen Stone away from his family and community. According to Dr. Stephen Rowe, the trauma surgeon who would later treat him, Stone had been struck by a total of 4 to 5 bullets at very close range. One round actually hit Stone directly in the chest, but his ballistic vest, which he always wore per department policy, stopped what they believed would have been a lethal wound. Another bullet came within less than a centimeter of severing his trachea. He got very lucky here. Stephen said that while laying in the ditch experiencing intense pain and with compromised senses, that he wanted to return fire, but that he was worried about hitting innocent motorists. The attack also felt endless, like these guys went absolutely insane when they ambushed him. Before we get into Stephen's recovery, let me explain what happened after Ramos and Saucedo got back in their pickup truck and drove away after believing that they had killed him, because we also have chase footage of this happening too. As Stone was being rushed to the hospital, a massive law enforcement response developed. Officers located the suspect's pickup truck as a result of a civilian tip and attempted to stop. It turns out that this civilian was like scanning radars or something. But when they tried stopping Ramos and Saucedo, these guys just kept driving and opened fire on these officers as well. During this extended pursuit through Tyler, the suspects discharged approximately 60 to 70 rounds at law enforcement, while officers returned fire with 35 rounds. The pursuit ended when the pickup truck collided with another vehicle, and then overturned on Texas 64 just east of Old Henderson Highway. Both suspects sustained injuries in the crash, with one of them being very severe. Officers discovered both men were wearing body armor and found the pickup contained multiple weapons: an SKS assault rifle, a Tech-9, a Beretta, and a .22 caliber handgun. Chief Swindle later stated that stopping these men, who had already shot a state trooper and continued firing on other officers, was imperative in preventing further harm. Back at East Texas Medical Center, Dr. Rowe's trauma team worked to save Stone's life, and despite his severe injuries, he did survive the initial surgery. By Thursday morning, the hospital listed him in fair condition, which, in my opinion, it can't be overstated how remarkable this is, given everything that happened. Ramos, who was treated for crash injuries, was transferred to Smith County Jail, facing 14 counts of aggravated assault on a public servant, who's also being held for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Saucedo remained hospitalized in serious condition with the same charges, but he would eventually be discharged from the hospital. Their combined bond was set at $23 million. Authorities never actually determined why these two heavily armed and armored men from Tulsa had been traveling to Tyler, or what they had intended to do before Stone stopped them for speeding, but we do know that both of these men would be convicted and given 14 life sentences for their crimes. They won't be eligible for parole until they are 98 and 99 years old. On Saturday morning, 3 days after the shooting, Stone was discharged from the hospital. Officers from multiple agencies and his family gathered at the hospital as he held a brief press conference. Though his voice was weakened, he spoke very clearly. He first expressed gratitude to God for his survival, as well as his training, his colleagues, and his decision to always wear his ballistic vest. Stone's father-in-law, Marty, who was a former assistant district attorney in Smith County, told reporters that Stone's wife was handling the situation with remarkable composure. When Stone first regained consciousness after surgery, one of his first statements was an apology to his wife, though his family assured him he had nothing to apologize for. Marty did acknowledge that Stone, being someone who strives for perfection, might question whether he could have done something differently, but emphasized that no one could have done more in such circumstances. Almost a month later, on a Wednesday afternoon in April, Stone spoke with a reporter about his experience. Many details remained very vivid to him, spotting the speeding pickup, discovering suspicious items, and how he felt when he first saw Ramos pull the gun. What came next remained less clear to him. He does remember being hit, the intense burning in his shoulder, and the men continuing to fire, but this part was more blurry. At this point, he was mostly just engaged in recovery, addressing both physical damage and psychological trauma. He remained grateful to have survived and returned to his family, taking each day as it came. When I first saw that video, guys, I was almost sure that he didn't make it through this, but seeing that he did put a big smile on my face. And I hope in the almost 20 years since that this brave trooper has been doing well. By the early 90s, the man at the center of today's story, Gary Gene Smith, was 38 years old and living in Granite City, Illinois. Gary, unfortunately, did not have it easy at all. Life was very hard on him. He had no job and lived in a small apartment with his aunt, and most days he rode around town on a 10-speed bicycle with no specific location in mind. Money was scarce, and Smith had a dog named Eddie that he deeply loved. The animal was a mix of yellow collie and shepherd breeds, and with nothing in his pockets to buy food, Smith resorted to digging through the dumpsters behind a grocery store, hunting for scraps that he could give to his poor pet. Anyone who knew Gary knew that the bond between Smith and that dog was the strongest thing in his life. Gary started to become well known in his neighborhood as he was always out and about with no destination in mind, but he was also fairly known for behaviors that weren't so innocuous. And given everything that he went through, he was known as a very troubled person. By this point, so again, the early 90s, people who crossed paths with him noticed that he was beginning to be more reserved and jittery. At a cafe he frequented, Smith had developed an unusual routine. He would watch strangers intently, then pull out a pencil and sketch their faces. The drawings showed real skill, but many found this to be unusual. Some days he would just pace up and down the street and people would stay clear of him, and he just generally started to become more erratic overall. What some in the area would have known was that Smith's troubles actually went back decades. When he was 12, medical professionals evaluated him and told his mother that schizophrenia might be affecting her son, but it seems that this was never taken seriously. And even worse, after Smith reached adulthood, he started having some serious run-ins with the law. Over a 10-year period, he had accumulated arrests for burglary, illegal drug possession, and firearms violations, and just months before the event that we're about to get into, Gary's aunt discovered that he had 2 guns in their small apartment. This, combined with the fact that she also found out he was using speed regularly, prompted her to kick him out. With nowhere stable to live and still no income, Smith drifted through Granite City as he usually would, only now without even a bed to sleep in. He was homeless, he had a dog to feed, he was already going untreated psychologically, and he had a hard drug habit. This was a complete recipe for disaster, and as you can imagine, it only escalated when he got kicked out onto the streets. Gary Gene Smith's erratic behavior began to increase, and eventually, he began telling people around him that he was certain he had lived before as a prisoner in a Nazi death camp during World War II. Sometimes he became convinced that police officers were actually soldiers trying to kill him. He would even goose-step around town. These false perceptions completely warped his understanding of reality, trapping him in a world that only he could see, and this all reached its boiling point on the 4th of February in 1994. On this Friday evening, Smith was doing what he would normally do. He was biking around town. Nothing really seemed out of the ordinary, at least not for Gary, but we do know that at some point, he mentioned to someone that he planned to visit the dumpster behind the grocery store with his dog, searching for food as usual, so this was a night where they didn't have anything to eat. But what happened over the next few hours was far more than just a dumpster visit, and it was something that honestly should have never ever been able to happen. At some point on this Friday evening, someone witnessed Smith laughing while looking at his dog, Eddie. The laughter seemed a bit excessive, even for Gary, and just moments later, he suddenly snapped. Without warning or explanation, Smith fired his gun at Eddie. He was struck by 2 bullets. With his dog and onlookers beginning to freak out, Smith now headed to Namioki Village Shopping Center, and what he would do there was all caught on camera. As Gary Gene Smith was reaching the mall, customers outside already felt an immediate alarm go off. He was evidently psychologically unwell and was moving with an exaggerated goose step. Emergency calls almost immediately began flooding in. A 9mm semi-automatic pistol still dangled from Smith's left hand. His body looked gaunt and his movements were said to be jerky, and apparently grass protruded from both of his ears. Multiple witnesses reported foam around his mouth, and very quickly, while outside a video store, Smith fired his gun at 2 innocent individuals. A 33-year-old woman who was hit in the leg, and a 21-year-old unarmed male security guard who was struck in the abdomen. Upon hearing this, people in the nearby video store started to catch on, and one person yelled to run. We can see as everyone begins to panic, running towards the door, but that was exactly where Gary Gene Smith was headed towards, and as he entered, everyone inside freaked out and ran to the opposite side. The group even ran by a young child and left her there, to where one awesome guy ran back and stood with her. He comforted the little girl as Smith walked by, and Smith leaned over and said, "Hello, God bless you, buddy. They're driving me crazy." He then went deeper inside. He thankfully had no interest in bothering these 2. he quickly went from offering blessings to being very aggressive again as Smith aimed his firearm at an employee behind the counter. He ordered her to take him to underground safety caverns, which people later connected to his Nazi death camp delusions. The woman who was behind the counter remained very composed and actually ended up just leading him towards the basement while not going with him. She stepped back. But before he has a chance to go anywhere, he sees the police and hears gunfire. This does not deter him, it makes him want to face them, so he hops out through an already shattered window and stands off with them. Gary's pistol held 16 rounds and he fired 10 to 14 of them. The officers fired back and more than 40 bullets flew through the air. Several vehicles took hits and Smith also fired at 3 additional innocent people, luckily not hitting any of them. Eventually, police bullets struck Smith. He collapsed in the parking lot and was now deceased. In total, 2 people were struck, but everyone else was okay here, including the little girl and the man who protected her. If you're wondering why the glass door that Gary Gene Smith jumped out of was already shattered, it wasn't because of the bullets. Apparently, a 15-year-old boy who realized what was going on just straight up jumped through the glass door behind the counter to escape, only to find his mother, so the woman who was shot in the leg before he entered, was outside and injured. After this whole ordeal, paramedics took her to St. Elizabeth Medical Center where doctors treated her leg and released her. The security guard who was hit in the abdomen underwent surgery for his wound, and by Monday morning, he was recovering well. But I actually have some more amazing news to tell you. Gary's dog, Eddie, actually survived the 2 gunshot wounds that he received prior to Gary's trip to the mall. Dr. Tim Holt, a Granite City vet, treated the 2 wounds, which were in his neck, and while recovering from surgery, the community rallied together with the Madison County Humane Society and they covered all medical expenses for Eddie. So yeah, badass dog. Investigators searched Gary Gene Smith's previous apartment and find nothing. His aunt theorized that Smith knew he wouldn't survive and couldn't bear abandoning his dog, so he wanted to put Eddie out of his misery. Police also contacted the ATF to trace the gun, and in the process they found that Gary's criminal record should have barred him from ever possessing firearms. During a grand jury hearing, 17 jurors heard from the detective and witnesses. After 2 hours, the jury concluded that the officers were justified in using deadly force, and they were acquitted of any charges that they were facing. Gary's aunt testified about her nephew's battle with mental illness, and the inquest revealed coroners found dirt and grass packed in Smith's ears. Because of this, his aunt said that he must have been experiencing auditory hallucinations. She stressed that the family believed he never intended to harm anyone, but regardless of that, it was abundantly clear that he had been a threat to public safety for years. Testimony also suggested that over-the-counter stimulant pills might have worsened his mental illness and fueled his delusions. The video store was eventually reopened and everyone involved recovered, though the community did have to ask themselves some difficult questions. The only person to pass away in this incident was Gary Gene Smith himself. And in the grand scheme of things, the story is simply a very tragic one. The video you're looking at is very eerie. It just has that early-ish YouTube feeling with the slideshow format, the Blade Runner music. It checks all the boxes. However, this upload contains images that are very real, and if we keep watching, we see some incredibly disturbing things. The video starts with imagery that is tragic, but is kind of far away from what appears to be some sort of crashed ships. You can see fire as well as rescue efforts, though the quality is obviously pretty low. But as this video goes on, it gets to photos that were taken directly aboard one of these ships, and well, let's just say that these images are not for the faint of heart. And we'll get there, but let me first explain what this video is about and what it's called, because I figure most of you do not speak Italian. The title translates to Slideshow of Images Taken by Firefighters of the Moby Prince Tragedy. And if you are even remotely familiar with this disaster, that should strike some discomfort into you. The Moby Prince disaster is the worst maritime tragedy to ever take place in Italy during peacetime, and the way that the innocent people aboard this passenger ferry met their fate is not only disturbing, but very heartbreaking. On April 10, 1991, a ferry called the Moby Prince left Livorno, Italy for Sardinia with 141 people aboard. This number consists of 75 passengers and 66 crew members. Minutes after departure, it collided with an oil tanker that was illegally anchored and carrying 80,000 tons of crude oil. This impact ruptured the tanker's hull, which sprayed oil directly onto the ferry and ignited an inferno. The crew and passengers aboard the Moby Prince gathered in a fireproof lounge, and they were just expecting rescue. But unfortunately, the air conditioning on the ship ended up pumping toxic fumes into this fireproof lounge. 22 minutes after the impact, the Moby Prince's radio operator broadcast frantic mayday calls, but the transmission carried a pretty big flaw. He was using a portable VHF transmitter with weak signal strength rather than the fixed radio set.
Do you read me?
Moby, please. Moby, please. My name,
The commander of the oil tanker ship made radio contact with rescuers and declared that the ship had struck a small refueling service boat, which unfortunately misidentified what actually happened. This catastrophic miscommunication directed all rescue efforts exclusively toward the tanker rather than searching for a passenger ferry with 141 people that were waiting to be rescued. In the end, help didn't reach the ferry for almost an hour. I believe it was 57 minutes. Nearly every single person passed away from carbon monoxide poisoning. Out of the 141 people on board, 140 would perish. Only a single survivor, a 23-year-old crewman, was pulled from the burning wreck. Investigations revealed a series of failures. The ferry's radar was off, the tanker's power had failed before the crash, this was actually just found out a few years ago, and rescue communication just completely broke down. This report that I was talking about from 2022 later concluded that a third unidentified ship had caused the ferry to veer into the tanker and that secret military operations may have been occurring in the harbor that night. This is a very big rabbit hole. There's a lot of entries in this video, so I won't be going too deep, but people in Italy have not forgotten this, and no one has ever been held accountable for what happened. Okay, so I'm recording this later, I'm just popping in to add it quick, but it seems that there were some people who were out on or running to the stern decks who likely did pass away from the heat of the fire, that combined with the smoke, as the one lone survivor did say in interviews that he heard screams for a period of time after, which is just very awful to imagine. My friend Etch-a-Sketch is a great source for these stories and posts a lot of them into my Discord and the Case Suggestions channel. I'll put the link at the top of the description if you have anything to recommend, but when they sent me all of this footage, I went down a pretty big rabbit hole, so we're gonna go through what they sent me. And this video in particular really is harrowing, especially considering it's on YouTube. So just going back to it, this footage contains a bunch of photos that firefighters took when they were documenting the horror of the aftermath. In the beginning, it's just kind of distant photos of the rescue operation, but they travel through the ship afterwards, photographing what they saw, and we can see some very disturbing things. There's individuals who did not make it through, barely recognizable due to the fire, and one who even appears to be on the ground in a crawling position outside on the deck. I mean, there is a chance that they were pulled out there prior, we don't know, but if this is one of those ones that the lone survivor recalls hearing, it makes it that much more devastating. Another piece of media related to this disaster is this photo. I want you to pause and see if you notice anything while looking at it, because until I was given context, I didn't. If you look closely, you'll actually notice handprints along the sides of the vehicles, indicating that some crew members took this direction in an effort to escape, feeling their way through this room in their final moments. This video, though not confirmed, is alleged to have been taken by people in a nearby ship who started recording soon after the Moby Prince collided with the oil tanker. People would have still been alive and slowly passing away on the ship as this was taken, but those who took it did not pursue the ferry to help. Finally, we have what I personally find is some of the most disturbing footage pertaining to this disaster. Nothing bad specifically happens in this footage, but it was taken by a family beforehand. And knowing that every single member of it would not make it through this is highly unsettling. You can see the young ones and even a crew member holding a passenger's baby with no idea what was about to happen to them. Every single person that you see in this footage passed away shortly after. We see shots of the lounge, the family grabbing their things before fleeing. It's just so sad. This was featured in a pretty large documentary, so I apologize for the lower quality. To fall under fair use, I have to do more than just talk over it sometimes. A lot of you probably wonder why I use filters and slow things down, but that's why. There's a lot more out there that I simply cannot show you, but nonetheless, this is one of the most disturbing ferry disasters I've ever heard of. And again, thank you to my friend over on Discord for sharing me virtually all of this media. Thinking of these last moments or imagining it is one thing, but to see them is another. And it really does suck that nobody was ever held responsible for any element of this. I know many Italian people are very unhappy with that. And I also want to focus on the one lone survivor for a second who pointed out in many interviews that he could not sleep well due to this event and the consistent horrible nightmares that he had. Being the only survivor of something like this is unimaginable, as there's not a single other person out there who can properly relate to what you experienced. Rest in peace to every single person who lost their lives in this horrific disaster, and my heart goes out to all of those who have been affected by it. So I have to open this with an obligatory, this entry is on the fun side. I know every time I cover this sort of thing, a small group of people get upset and say it's not serious enough or whatever, like with this one a few videos ago, but today's is a bit more interesting and quite honestly, I don't care. Sometimes it's good to take a little break from the absolutely horrible stuff, and I just cover things that I'm interested in. I'm not going to change that because of numbers or anything. On October 10th, 2005, a red light camera in Mesa, Arizona captured a vehicle running a red light, and as per procedure, the Mesa Police Department issued a citation to the owners by mail. Along with the fine, the envelope included a photo of the incident, clearly showing a car in violation of the light. The ticket was addressed and sent to a man named James Hamburg. And at first, this would just seem like an open and shut case. I mean, it's just a fucking speeding ticket, but it didn't take long for the story to take a strange turn, because as it turns out, James Hamburg had died 5 years earlier. When the Hamburg family received the notice, they were understandably confused. Looking at the image, not only was James Hamburg behind the wheel, but his wife, Lorraine, appeared to be in the passenger seat. And if things weren't weird enough, they knew that Lorraine couldn't have been in the car because she was 80 years old and she was recovering from heart surgery at home on that day. It went around the family a bit, and it turns out that Stephen Hamburg, so James and Lorraine's son, confirmed that his wife was actually out in the vehicle that day. So when they looked at it, it just made it even more odd. That clearly wasn't his wife, and remember, although it's not a high quality photo, they swear that they see James and Lorraine in the vehicle. And it was addressed to James Hamburg, so they started thinking that maybe this was some very old ticket that finally made its way to their home, but they learned that it was correctly dated as October 10th, 2005. More on this shortly. And so again, the situation just seemed impossible to them. The locations of all family members were accounted for. Stephen knew where his father was, he knew where his mother was, and he knew very well who had the car. Yet the photo told a completely different story. The two people in the car looked exactly like his parents, one of whom was already deceased. Stephen took the issue to the police and successfully had the ticket dismissed after confirming James was deceased, but the photo continued to raise questions. As I mentioned, one theory was that the image may have been part of an older citation, perhaps mistakenly issued in 2005, but not only did the date not hold up, one of the buildings in the background had only been built within the past year. Archived citations, according to policy, were destroyed after 3 years. Even if the image had somehow survived, it still would have originated at least 2 years after James Hamburg's death. So how was James supposedly in this photo? With no other explanation, investigators eventually concluded that the only plausible scenario was that someone else must have been driving, and that the person must have looked remarkably like James. To them, the idea that the family was lying seemed more realistic than the photograph being wrong, and I totally agree. But the Hamburgers stood by their version of events, and as far as they were concerned, the timeline didn't allow for any manipulation. Only James's wife had the car, and Lorraine never left the house. And that's really where the case sits. There hasn't been any updates since. I'm not gonna lie to you, this is cool, but my mind immediately goes to James's wife being in the car with someone else. Maybe someone she wasn't supposed to be with, or maybe someone she forgot being with. I mean, we know she had the car, and let's be honest, the guy was deceased. His wife was at home recovering from surgery. I really just don't know what else this could be. It would be a really cool paranormal feat if this was the case, but I personally don't buy it. Nonetheless, I found this really interesting when I came across it on the obscure Unsolved Mysteries iceberg, and you know, when I see an old unsecured webpage like this talking about anomalies, I'm all for it. On September 2nd, 1995, thousands of families gathered along Toronto's waterfront for the Canadian International Airshow. It was a beautiful late summer day. Children sat on their parents' shoulders with ice cream, and over 10,000 spectators had already seen a number of incredible aircraft demonstrations, now sitting there waiting for the next aircraft to appear. Among the weekend's performers was a Royal Air Force Nimrod MR2P, a massive maritime patrol jet that had crossed the Atlantic to represent British aviation and to continue a long charitable partnership with Canada. For more than a decade, the squadron's appearances in Toronto had raised tens of thousands of dollars for their hospital for sick children, sick kids. So this visit was both a demonstration of skill and a continuation of that awesome cause. The 7-man crew of the Nimrod were seasoned professionals, all had display experience and extensive operational flying hours. The day before the show, Dom Gilbert, the 31-year-old captain, had told a reporter that for his Toronto show, they planned to push the Nimrod close to its limits, and their first appearance of the tour at the Shearwater Airshow in Nova Scotia, which was a week earlier, had gone perfectly, so there's no reason anyone should have been concerned. The Nimrod combined the presence of a military patrol craft with unexpected agility, at least for its size. The team's display routine, which was 2 circuits, 2 looping turns, and a slow pass with the landing gear lowered, had been flown safely for nearly 20 years, but the sequence was designed to show off the aircraft's capabilities, not to push its limits. So depending on what he meant by that, it could have been a cause for concern. But yeah, up to this point, it was just sort of vague in some sense. So a week would pass, the Saturday would come, and this day in Toronto was clear and calm. It was deemed to be perfect weather. And so expectedly, families lined the lakeshore early, spreading blankets and waiting for the day's highlight acts. At around 3:25 p.m., the Nimrod lifted off from Pearson International Airport and approached the lakefront at low altitude. The first maneuvers unfolded smoothly. They did a super cool pass, a climb, and a wide turn. To the spectators, it looked effortless. Remember, this is an enormous aircraft moving with the precision of a fighter, and I haven't seen one, but I couldn't imagine the presence that these things have. But unknown to the crowd, Captain Gilbert had quietly adjusted the routine after a minor error at a previous show, tightening his turns and reducing engine power to keep the aircraft closer to the display area, pushing it to its limits. This change was not officially approved or tested, and it reduced the aircraft's safety margin. At the time, there was much less training for display pilots, and once cleared, they operated largely on their own. But still, this is a trusted pilot, and there's never been an issue in the past. The thing is, in that environment, a small change could have dangerous consequences, and in this case, things were about to go horribly wrong. As Nimrod XV-239 entered its second looping turn, everything still seemed normal. The aircraft climbed to roughly 950 feet, with the flaps partially extended. Following his new routine, Gilbert reduced power to slow down and tighten the curve, but as his speed dropped to around 120 knots, which was well below what the Nimrod needed to stay safely airborne, the aircraft lost lift. It began to roll left, and its nose started to drop as the wing stopped generating enough lift to support its weight. People saw it falter mid-term. Some thought it was just part of the display, but others who knew a bit more realized instantly that something was wrong. The jet tilted sharply downward, and although the crew pushed the throttles forward and tried to recover, they were too low to regain control. The Nimrod struck Lake Ontario about 800 meters offshore, breaking apart on impact. And sadly, all 7 crew members passed away instantly. Very quickly, this cool, family and charity-oriented event turned into disbelief and grief. Rescue boats and helicopters arrived within minutes, and divers recovered wreckage, the flight recorder, and all 7 men by nightfall. The airshow was suspended as families left the waterfront in silence. The following day, the Northern Lights aerobatic team flew a missing man formation in tribute to the Nimrod crew. Across the Atlantic, flags at Royal Air Force locations were lowered to half-mast, with memorial services being held for the fallen. It's important to remember that these men were fathers, sons, and friends who crossed an ocean for charity, and they had a lot of pride in their work. The Royal Air Force Board of Inquiry later confirmed what the recovered data had already showed. There'd been no mechanical failure. The aircraft was in good condition, and the cause was human judgment and lack of oversight. This unapproved change to the routine had, expectedly, eliminated critical safety margins, leading the Nimrod into an unrecoverable stall. The inquiry also pointed to a wider issue, which was insufficient training, limited practice opportunities, and minimal supervision for airshow pilots who came from regular squadrons rather than specialized display units. After the investigation, the Royal Air Force completely overhauled its display training program. Crews were now required to receive structured instruction, simulator sessions, and supervised practice flights before performing publicly. There was also now a single dedicated team to handle all Nimrod displays to ensure consistency and safety. These reforms, even though they were born from tragedy, reshaped Royal Air Force display and still have a positive impact today. Memorials holding the 7 men exist in both Canada and the United Kingdom. The 1995 crash remains the deadliest in the history of the Canadian International Airshow, and just over 3 decades later, no fatal airshow accidents have occurred in Toronto, largely due to the lessons learned from that day. Rest in peace to the 7 men who lost their lives in this crash. This is one I went down the rabbit hole on when someone sent me a Wikipedia article and I started doing the quintessential male thing. But it just blows my mind hearing the death toll, and it honestly is so sad when you consider the context. It takes place in a soup kitchen, and you may be tempted to click off if you don't like anything history related, but this isn't a history class, it's just a very tragic story. I came across it and I haven't seen a single person speak about it. Winter of 1878 brought waves of starving refugees into Tianjin, a municipality in China. The Dingwu famine had devastated northern China for 3 years at this point, ultimately claiming between 9 and 13 million lives. Very malnourished people came into the city daily, fleeing provinces where crops had failed and wells had run dry. They did this because Tianjin's authorities established 12 soup kitchens to feed roughly 60,000 displaced people. These were really locked down as governing bodies feared the social chaos that could have been triggered by mass starvation. The Baoshang facility, which meant preserve life, is a location of this entry, and it served exclusively women and young children. By early January, over 2,000 people had packed into the compound, and workers quickly had to build extra shelters from bamboo and reeds to hold the growing crowd. The huts were linked by narrow paths that only one person could pass through, and there was just one exit gate, which officials kept locked. On the morning of January 6, 1878, strong northwest winds battered the city, and inside the crowded compound, women gathered with their children for their morning porridge distribution. But moments after breakfast, a small fire as well as smoke started appearing in one of the corners. The dried reeds caught fire instantly, and winds turned it into a racing inferno that consumed the structures within minutes. Mothers grabbed their children and surged toward the only exit. The narrow pathways became deadly bottlenecks where people fell and were trampled in the choking smoke. But get this, at the exit gate, the gatekeeper obviously faced a mob pounding on the locked door. However, he was still adamantly set on following his orders, and his orders had always been clear. Refugees were not permitted free movement. And whether frozen by protocol or overwhelmed, it seems it was protocol, he kept the door locked as flames closed in. This guy trapped thousands of women and children inside as this fire quickly grew, staying loyal to his orders. Nonetheless, surviving witnesses reported mothers shielding their children with their bodies in those final moments, screams of absolute terror, and yeah, you get the picture. You can probably imagine just how terrible this would have been. The fire burned for over 10 hours, and workers eventually recovered 1,019 identifiable bodies, but countless others were consumed completely. The estimated death toll reached approximately 2,000 women and children, with only 300 to 400 managing to escape. Officials organized burials and dismissed the facility's committee members, but then made a devastating decision. They closed all 12 soup kitchens immediately, forcing nearly 60,000 refugees back onto winter streets with only small rations. Many people subsequently passed away from starvation and exposure. The Baoshang disaster stands among the deadliest fires in 19th century Chinese history. It absolutely blew my mind reading this, and yeah, I figured I'd touch on it. I came across this X-ray image recently while scrolling online, and I was just absolutely dumbfounded. I didn't know if this was even real, how something like this could happen, or if it was real. Maybe it's not as bad as it actually looks. but this is obviously very bad. I just had so many questions, and then I looked into this. It turns out it is very real, and the story behind it is fascinating. At 21 years old, James Valentine had already spent 6 years working as a tree trimmer. Not only was this now his profession, but it had been something that he was passionate about before it even started earning him money, so it wasn't some job that he had to drag himself into. He'd always been a bit of an outdoorsman, and by 2014, James was living in Pittsburgh and working with a company called Adler Tree Service in Gibsonia. Things were going as well as you could expect, and for his age, he was great at what he did. And so that's what makes what happens on the day of March 31st, 2014, so awful. On this day, at around 2:30 in the afternoon, James climbed into his harness and secured his helmet, then ascended 20 feet into a Scotch pine on Perry Highway. The work seemed routine, but like in many instances when it comes to this sort of work, power lines ran nearby, so this forced him into an uncomfortable position as he maneuvered his saw. I imagine there was probably a safer way to approach this angle-wise. We don't have a video of what happened here or anything, but either way, he pulled the trigger and pressed the spinning blade against the wood in this weird angle, avoiding the power lines. But within a heartbeat, the saw struck a dense knot hidden in the timber. Because of this, the chainsaw jerked backwards with a brutal force, and suddenly, the running blade was no longer in James's control. It was inside of him. It was buried in the junction where his shoulder met his neck. But miraculously, this did not hit his carotid artery, at least not yet. The stakes here were still incredibly high. Most people would have frozen or thrashed in terror here, but instead, James, while trying to remain calm, reached up and switched off the motor. Mind you, I'm describing this like it's some simple thing, but by this point there would have been lots of hemorrhaging, and he's still 20 feet up there in the bucket. This is a terrible situation to be in. When his colleagues slowly lowered him down, James held the saw with one hand to keep things stable, and once they eventually reached him, they faced a decision that would essentially determine whether James lived or died. Someone recognized that pulling the embedded blade free would unleash massive hemorrhaging. Others thought maybe it was a good idea to remove it, but instead, they opted to leave the blade in, eventually deciding to remove the motor housing, leaving only the blade and chain in place for medical personnel. This choice proved vital. Greg Porter, who helped coordinate the EMS response, arrived to find James still conscious. But the responders' primary challenge soon became transporting him without shifting the blade even slightly, since any movement could sever the major vessels running millimeters away. And so while they transported him, the blade remained lodged in. It carved 3 inches into his shoulder and another inch into his neck, going through his traps and another group of muscles that I'm not even going to try and pronounce. It turns out that it missed his carotid artery by a 1/4 inch, and the blade also completely missed his windpipe, esophagus, and spine. While they carefully transported him, staff at a nearby general hospital received a 10-minute warning that something unprecedented was incoming. The doctor who directed the trauma intensive care unit gathered her team and prepared for the absolute worst, and when the ambulance doors opened, they saw a young man sitting upright, fully conscious, with a chainsaw blade protruding from his neck. One person was assigned exclusively to hold that blade motionless while others worked around him, and an X-ray captured this image that would eventually circulate worldwide and find me 11 years later so I could tell you his story. The doctor evaluated James and saw that he could speak clearly, indicating his airway remained open. When she asked him to move his toes, he did so immediately, which was proof that his spinal cord hadn't been damaged. And so even though he was obviously distressed and experiencing shock, he wasn't hysterical. Additional imaging showed his chest and lungs were unharmed with no internal problems, and against all probability, the blade had navigated between every single critical structure, damaging only muscle tissue and smaller vessels that surgeons could easily control. The surgery was far less dire than they were expecting when they got the warning, and it was a success. By Tuesday morning, so less than 24 hours after the accident, James was on his feet and speaking normally. His sister Becca came to visit and later shared with journalists that her brother seemed like himself again, and James recognized just how lucky he was, but still planned on going back to work as a trimmer. Physical therapists began working with him that same day, helping him regain movement in his affected arm, and then Wednesday arrived, and just 48 hours after a power tool had been lodged in his neck, James Valentine left the hospital under his own power. Doctors anticipated complete healing within weeks, and no lasting complications were expected for someone his age and health level. So yeah, it's a good ending this time, and this incident actually became a textbook case for teaching trauma protocols, because the fundamental rule for impalement injuries gained a very vivid illustration. Stabilize the object where it is, transport with extreme care, and only remove in a surgical setting with full resources available. And just a reminder, in case you ever find yourself in a similar situation, this principle applies whether the object is small or large. His survival story eventually appeared on Untold Stories of the ER, and years later in 2025, some YouTuber would cover it half as well. This x-ray became one of 2014's most widely shared medical images, and I'm sure I saw it back then, but I don't really remember, so I was excited to dig into the actual story when I came across this. And I'm glad I did. I hope James Valentine, who would now be in his 30s, is doing awesome. He seems really cool. Thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate it so much. This is by far the most time I've ever put into a project. Even today, I was up at 5 a.m. It's 6:30 p.m. right now. I'm pretty tired, but it's absolutely worth it. I finally upgraded my computer, so if you couldn't tell, it's in 4K now. A lot of the stuff just looks cleaner, but the concept's still always going to be the same. I'll see you guys again soon, and I hope you enjoyed this. I know it's not exactly 50 minutes, but I had to cut one of them, so yeah, here we are.